Welcome back, everyone. Alina, over to you. I pressed the button.
Thank you. Thank you. I know this wasn't really a break, so I'm not going to mention anything. It's nice to have our next speakers, some colleagues that are very, very dear to me. As I mentioned at the very beginning, Emília Perez from NITRA really has been at the center of this Translating Europe workshop summer school series initiative. And today, together with Francesca from another colleague from another institution in Italy, they will really present their stories about how to initiate, design, implement accessibility training by cooperating with creative teams and target audiences, and how these collaborations between academics and students and the world out there can happen, and some of the challenges as well, but also some of the solutions. So thank you again. The floor is yours. I made Emília a co-host, so I'm assuming that that you are sharing. But Francesca, if you're also sharing, I'm also going to make you co-host.
Yeah, I'm going to share my our presentation after. So yeah, we should be both co-hosts if possible.
Okay, and in the meantime, let me just share my screen for the beginning. Okay. And if you just maybe Francesca could note that everything is fine and the slides are changing, right? Because that's what happens to me usually. Okay, and I hope everyone can hear me well. So thank you very much and good afternoon to all of you, but also hello to you, Alina. It's been really nice to see you again. And I want to thank you for organizing this event this year because I've been following since the morning and it's really been very amazing. It is our pleasure to be here as well. My name is Emília Perez. I work at Constantine the Philosopher University in Nitra in Slovakia. And today, as was said, I will present together with my dear colleague, but especially with my dear friend Francesca Raffi from University of Macerata in Italy. I'm a white woman, 37 years old. I'm quite tall and my figure could be described as something sporty, at least before Christmas. So hopefully it will be fine again after a while. I have blue eyes, brown hair, and today I'm wearing glasses with a black frame and a black polo neck. So today, with my colleague Francesca, we will speak about accessibility to cultural spaces, and we will both somehow try to invite you to our two worlds. And those two worlds mean two things, because both of us are actually active as trainers at university. We train future translators, interpreters, also in the field of accessibility and audiovisual translation. But both of us are also active in practice, very often invited to cooperate as accessibility coordinators, advisors, or people who supervise the whole process. So what we are going to talk about today will be mainly the processes and tools which are required to implement accessibility to live events and cultural spaces. And we will focus mainly on sensory access, and we will focus mainly on the environment of theater and opera and film festivals. We will try to introduce some relevant legislation, processes, projects, which can help you if you are maybe at the beginning of your journey, or if you are a person who is in similar position as us. We will try to point your attention to some of successful stories and projects which can be a source of inspiration for you as well. And then, based on our experience, both me and Francesca will show how we connected these two worlds that I mentioned at the very beginning, and how we try to train future professionals in the area of accessibility, but mainly in the point that they gain a lot of experience also in cooperation with creative teams and target audiences, because as it will be clear, we both believe this is absolutely essential. So if you are maybe in similar position as me, or if you were, then that means you might be coming from very traditional translation and interpreting study program. And sometimes as trainers, but also sometimes as students or graduates, you can still come across, at least in some regions of Europe, the idea whether accessibility is something translators should actually be trained in. Is this something you are going to do? Is it something we should train as trainers? Is it something which should be super specialist away from translation and interpreting training? And this would be a topic for the whole presentation on its own. So I just always like to get back in this debate to work of my dear colleagues from Nitra, Professor Gromova and Professor Miglova, who for quite a while were observing changes in profession of translators. And they grouped all of the changes they were able to identify into 3 main categories. And I think all of them actually provide response to the question I raised at the beginning. So the changes which are there and which always has been there are related to the way how we understand what text actually is, and to new genres which are there for translators and interpreters. So probably when I was trained, which was quite a while ago, I would have very traditional view of what I'm going to translate and what I'm going to come across. But nowadays, what I'm working on is very, very different, but actually I'm connecting everything I learned before. We all know, everyone who's in translation and in interpreting, that the technologies are changing very rapidly. And they, of course, are there to help us, but they also somehow boost the process of changes, how we look at what translation and interpreting could mean, and how could it help in provision of access. Professional environment is changing absolutely. We more and more in various fora speak about how there are new profiles for future translators and interpreters, how we need upskilling, how we need to think in more comprehensive way. And in a way, this is bringing us very directly from thinking of translation and interpreting, maybe in the more traditional way, to think about accessibility as being the people who help to provide or ensure access to information, content, culture, in our case today, cultural spaces for everyone. And if you follow this year's Translating Europe Forum, you could see quite a lot of debates going in this way. So we had an event which is focused on translation. It's important in communication process. It's important in access to information. But in many debates, we could hear about the notion of accessibility really being present in everything that we do. So in case you haven't followed this event, you can find most of the content online, and I would like to direct your attention there. But now I'll continue with what we want to talk about more in detail today. So what we focus on with Francesca, but also with many other colleagues who are here with us today, is that we really are thinking about translation in the maybe more complex way, and we are thinking and moving from the idea of seeing it as a way of providing linguistic access to provision of access in more general way, because even the translation as interlingual activity or interpreting is about providing access in its own. And we are also thinking more about moving from access to entertainment, which at least in my country, this is the main area for accessibility. So normally a person who wants to be active in this field would think about entertainment, TV content, video games. But I think it's very important, and we already heard it today, that we have to speak about access of content, information, and communication in general. And we have seen this development for the last 15 years, and we see that in translation studies is becoming more and more present. But what we see lately are even more complex ideas, and these are the ones both me and Francesca will relate to today. So I will go back to first year of this event, from accessibility to inclusion, where we had the chance to listen to a great lecture by Elena Di Giovanni in 2021. And she was speaking about difference in moving from accessibility to inclusion in providing services which actually are including those we are trying to target with what we provide as a service. And in her talk, she was distinguishing slightly between accessibility and inclusion in the way how she understands these two concepts, seeing accessibility as something which help us get everyone to what she calls a neutral position. So we all have the same access and actually everything works, which is fine. But in inclusion, she's actually pointing out the importance of becoming part of all of the processes in providing access from the very beginning. She speaks about various groups of users with their own various disabilities, because this can mean many different things, to be involved in all stages of the design of, let's say, cultural events we are preparing, which makes perfect sense, because in the end, this can actually lead us to creating group of professionals, but also group of audience, which cooperates together on something which in result can really work very well. We can find very similar strategy mentioned in the works dealing with integrated access, either in the area of accessible filmmaking or speaking about integrated access when relating to creative teams. If we speak about cultural events, maybe we could even broaden it up and speak not only about becoming part and integrated in the whole creative process, but to become integrated in the whole organizing process. Because actually, if you are organizing cultural event, there are many, many things which you have to plan beforehand. And these last two concepts, which I very briefly introduced, actually speak about really bringing all the persons responsible for access and people who can contribute to create access together in planning the common result. Okay. And now it's Francesca's turn.
Thank you very much. Hope you can hear me and see the presentation. Thank you very much, Emília. So first of all, I'm going to quickly describe myself. I'm Francesca Raffi. I'm a white woman. I'm 37 years old. Have long brown hair and brown eyes. Today I'm wearing a black t-shirt and I'm smiling because I'm very happy to be here with Emília, a dear colleague, but especially a dear friend. And thank you very much, Alina, for the invitation. Why is accessibility and accessibility training important? We are going to try to answer this question starting from legislations. And we are going to focus specifically on Europe, of course. First of all, we have, the background is not European, but it's broader. That is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of the UN, which states that persons with disabilities have the right to fully participate in all aspects of life, including, of course, the enjoyment of cultural spaces and live events. And as you know, this is also in line with the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy. But as for Europe, in 2010, we had the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which was quite generic, though. However, the European Union opened the way to stronger protection of the rights of persons with disabilities in the latest revision of the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. This means that especially audiovisual media products that we have also in a cultural context and live events, of course, should include sign language, subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing, spoken subtitles, and audio description. The more recent legal reference that we have in Europe in terms of accessibility services is the European Accessibility Act. As you know, this is a directive that aims to improve the functioning of the internal market for accessible products and services, including media products in general, by removing barriers created by different rules that we have in Europe. So the directive is actually, the European Union actually adopted the directive in 2019, but we have two different phases, the transposition phase and the implementation phase. The first phase, so the transposition phase, is actually has been actually effective since June 2022, and it requires the member states to have a reasonable plan. So reasonable is the key word because, again, it's quite generic. A reasonable plan in place for incorporating the Accessibility Act in their national legislation. The second phase, so the implementation phase, will be effective in 2025. So by then, member states' national laws must be applied. Of course, this legal context for accessibility in Europe has for sure increased the percentage of accessibility services provided, but the importance of quality is still underestimated. And as the European Federation of Hard of Hearing puts it, and I'm quoting, it is essential that quality is maintained alongside increasing quantity. So we should find a balance between quantity and quality. So in order to try to do that, we need to have in mind, and we need to focus on some goals and strategies. First of all, we should have a clear idea of what accessibility means and of where we can go, possibly moving even beyond accessibility. So we can make one step forward, that is planning in inclusive terms, placing the people with and their different abilities at the core. And this means, as Elena Di Giovanni states, moving from a neutral standpoint to reach a positive standpoint. The neutral standpoint is adapting an existing service and making it accessible. The positive standpoint is co-designing and redesigning with users, sharing experiences, and adopting an inclusive approach. That is a kind of continuous experiment. It's a methodology more than a goal, actually. This, of course, contributes to the empowerment and agency of people with different abilities and disabilities by including them in the process of creation and development of access services, but also the evaluation of access services, so that we can all be co-creators, let's say. Speaking of involvement, in a questionnaire carried out by the European Disability Forum in 2019, it was reported that persons with disabilities are generally not very satisfied with the accessibility solutions implemented by companies or organizations providing access services. And here, one of the main challenges is, in fact, the lack of professionals trained in the development and provision of access services. However, in the last decade, various European projects have been carried out. And here we have a list, and I'm going through the list of the main European projects, and I'm going to quickly describe them. So the first one is the Accessible Culture and Training Project, ACT. This was aimed to define a new professional profile, that of media accessibility expert or manager for the scenic arts. And this project resulted in the development of teaching and learning materials for a massive open online course, so an online course, to be considered at postgraduate level. The second one, it's similar to ACT, that is the AD Lab Pro project. This aimed to define a curriculum for training audio describers, so audio description professionals. And again, thanks to online contents to be used both at universities and in-house by companies. Moving from audio description to live subtitling, we have two different projects, the third one and the fourth one in the slide. The first one is the interlingual live subtitling for Access project, focusing on interlingual live subtitling. So, for instance, from English into English, from Spanish into Spanish. This aimed to develop the new professional profile of the ILSER, that is, a professional, an expert, who can produce interlingual live subtitles through respeaking. And again, this was done through an online course, so online training. As for intralingual live subtitling, we have the LTA project, and this was aimed to design a curriculum for real-time intralingual respeakers and stenotypists using Videotype. Again, thanks to online training materials. Finally, we have EASIT, so Easy Access for Social Inclusion Training Project. This specifically focused on easy to read. And again, through online materials. So again, online training. Of course, all these projects have advanced the present situation in various aspects. However, pedagogists and training experts state that learners should be trained in real-life contexts. And this is particularly true when it comes to accessibility practices. So in Italy, we tried to fill this gap. We are still working on this project, coordinated, designed, and created by Elena Di Giovanni. The Inclusive Guides project, we tried to adopt a people-centered approach. And we tried to offer an in-person training scheme for inclusive guides for theaters and cultural spaces in general, followed by at least one practical experience as a theater or a museum guide, leading groups of people with and without disabilities. The interesting thing is that this training scheme addressed blind and partially sighted people and deaf and hard of hearing people between 13 and 26 years of age. We did that in collaboration with the Italian Union of the Blind and Partially Sighted and the Italian Association for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Just to sum up, this was a 2-day, 10-hour training for inclusive guides, followed by, as I said, a practical experience as theater or museum guides. In order to organize this training course, we took into consideration a broader group of users. Participants then had to plan their own accessibility project by taking into account one or various groups of users with different abilities, and by relying on different services and tools. Inclusive videos, audio description, subtitles for the deaf, inclusive communication, and also the phase of working with people with disabilities and creating inclusive teams, let's say, to design and to carry out accessibility projects in theaters and cultural spaces in general. To plan this training program, we started from our experience in terms of research and practice. So the accessibility and inclusive projects that we have been carrying out since 2008, coordinated by Elena Di Giovanni in several Italian theaters. And we have a list: Macerata, Brescia, Rete Lirica Marche, Opera Domani, Bergamo, Modena, Iesi, Cremona. These are all Italian cities. In the slide, we have one of our, we say our, inclusive guides, a blind woman leading a tour. And then we have another picture with some of our youngest inclusive guides. They are guiding us to explore some tactile drawings. And then in this next slide, we have a picture with all the inclusive guides holding and showing their inclusive guide certificates and smiling. Well, this training program definitely contributed to the empowerment and agency of this group of blind and partially sighted and deaf and hard of hearing young people who became inclusive guides. This activated the process of social action. So they all felt involved in the design, in the creation, and in the development also of the access services that we all created all together as co-creators. So these are the conclusions, and the floor is yours, Emília.
Okay, just 1 second. Okay. Let me move a little bit. Okay. Fine. So for me, always when I'm listening about the initiatives from University in Macerata, but also from other colleagues, this is very inspiring because we really can see, and I think someone already, I think actually it was Camelia, sorry for not remembering, but mentioned that yes, actually many of us work in academia and we are interested in the topic of accessibility and inclusion in our work, but we are the change makers as well. And I think we can really contribute to change in what is happening in our countries. Well, in case of my countries, and those of you who know me know that I can be quite critical, there is quite a lot that needs to change. And I'm mentioning this because maybe some of you who are following us today are also coming from regions where accessibility is maybe not working so well in all of the areas, or where a lot has to be done. And in case of Slovakia, it's not so tragic as it maybe sounded at the beginning, but the main focus on access provision, if we speak mainly about linguistic access and access for sensory impaired viewers, is on TV broadcasting and maybe online streaming. But there is not much done outside this context. So whether we speak about legislation, regulation, and practice, whether we speak about what do most translators would think of if they think that maybe accessibility is something where I would like to gain some expertise, they would naturally think of TV broadcasting. And this is very traditional, I think, for Central and Eastern Europe. And in terms of legislation and regulation for this context, things actually work very well. We speak about amounts of what should be done. We speak a lot about quality. A lot is being followed and evaluated on national level. So actually here, things are not ideal, but they work. But if we look at the other areas, it's not so great. So if we speak about, for example, accessibility legislation or regulation in terms of cultural spaces and live events, it's almost non-existent. There are few documents which speak about physical accessibility of premises and cultural spaces. There are few documents related to provision of access to sensory impaired viewers in terms of distribution of audiovisual works. But unfortunately, there are also several flaws in the legislation, especially in case of the one for distribution. I think we have very clear criteria given on distributors to provide access to viewers, but unfortunately there is no duty for any cinema, no cultural event to actually stream things with the access or provide things with access. So you can get film which actually does have subtitles for deaf and hard of hearing, but if you went to any major cinema in Slovakia, you're never going to see a film with subtitles for deaf and hard of hearing. That's just one of the examples. So really in major productions and major cultural events, the amount of provided access is very limited. And really this is if we speak about major cinemas, theaters, film festivals, and many other types of events. If access is provided, then very often it's quite intuitive. Of course, we speak about some post-production quick solution. Very often if there was some funding, which is always great, but we can really see that the cooperation with experts was lacking. And we can definitely see a lot that any cooperation with target audience was lacking, and sometimes things don't work that great. If access is provided to live events, to cultural spaces, including film festivals, then very often we speak about traditional access provision. So we would really speak about some occasional film screenings for this and that group of audience. We would speak about special occasion captioned theater performances or theater performances with sign language, maybe interpreting provided on some special occasion, let's say in the week of deaf culture. And very often these strategies are not really inclusive. Existing practices usually target also either visually impaired or hearing impaired viewers. And if I am trying, and I'm very much trying to look for fully inclusive events in our country, there are very few. But there is one which I'm going to mention today as an example of one of the projects, and I will try to provide you an insight of how things can be done even in maybe countries where things are not working that well, and also how can we contribute from our work as academics and trainers. So the project I'm talking about is the One World Film Festival in Slovakia. It is International Documentary Film Festival, which is organized by the humanitarian organization People in Need. It is the biggest and oldest documentary event in the country. It's very popular. It takes place in the capital city of Slovakia, in Bratislava, every year. But mainly what is important for us today that it was and still is the first film festival in the country, which is incorporating inclusive and integrated access provision strategies. This has been happening for last 3 years. And the story was actually very exciting for me because in 2020, I was approached by the executive directors of this festival with the offer to provide some guidance and advice on how things maybe could be done. Of course, this is an ongoing project and there is still a lot we have to learn, but definitely this was very important signal in a country where no film festival that would be at least somehow inclusive or accessible took part ever before. 2020 was not ideal for the reasons which were mentioned many times today. It was the time of COVID-19 pandemic. The festival moved to online environment. It actually did enable us to test some modalities for its online form, but most of the program which normally happens was really complicated, but it was a good experience. And we used and learned many things in 2021 and in 2022, in other 2 years when the festival was running in a hybrid form. And there actually our activities in terms of accessibility and inclusion were growing, towards more films which were provided with full access, but also to industry program, to workshop, to debates and discussions. Now, this festival has very ambitious idea about accessibility and inclusion. And of course, I was not the person responsible for all of the parts because the target groups which were there and where we actually were trying to think of a modern inclusive design in Slovakia where of course users or viewers who do not speak Slovak. So this was about linguistic accessibility. Then it was deaf and hard of hearing audience, blind and visually impaired audience, but then also physically impaired, seniors, mothers with small children and viewers with no home. I will focus mainly on the linguistic accessibility and on the sensory accessibility because we don't have enough time to talk about all of them, but still this was very interesting experience for many of us. So the services which were provided, and it was quite a challenge if you think that you're starting from scratch, was provision of linguistic access. And this is something which was done before as well, of course. So we are talking about interlingual subtitling and interpreting of the other parts of the program, let's say debates, discussions, workshops. Then it was provision of audiovisual, for audio description for the blind, subtitling for deaf and hard of hearing, sign language interpreting for the debates and so-called industry program. We also worked on inclusive communication and targeted advertising, which proved to be very important, especially after the COVID year of the festival. Because again, if you think about that you want to address audience in the country, which is just not used to come to this type of events because there just was not that option before, this is very important. So targeted advertising already designed in cooperation with the representatives of communities, that is something which I always point out as very important. We were working on industry program with people with disabilities, and always we try to provide some also discussions where we would share our experience with other organizers. I'm not going to go to all of the details, but I think what is important to mention was that what I appreciate on cooperation with this festival, although it was difficult sometimes, was that the design for accessibility was done from the very first discussion about the next year of the festival. That means that from the very beginning, the first debate which was there was the debate in cooperation with access experts or some contact hubs, which were usually the institutions researching and training accessibility to some extent. Because usually these are the people who, in context which I'm describing, can provide contacts or good experience from other countries, how things are done somewhere else. Now, for service providers, it was the very same institution. So in my case, it was our department. Then it were associations representing the target communities. That means the community of deaf, hard of hearing. We also had very interesting debates with the other parts where or the festival was focusing on. So even for us, for example, imagine you are designing spatial or you are discussing spatial issues, but the festival wanted to be inclusive in some of the screenings, and we were really talking about bringing everyone together, people with no homes. We have strong influx of people coming to the country right now because what is unfortunately happening in Ukraine. So all of these were ideas we were putting together in various discussions, and I really think that we did the best to opt for participatory, inclusive approach, going for integrated access, and together redesigning whatever didn't work the previous year. But now I said we will try to join the two worlds. And I was talking about what was my experience as an accessibility advisor at this event, but what did we do with what we do in academia? So of course, if you are a trainer as well, you know that this calls for amazing opportunity for our trainees. And it is opportunity to really gain training on spot at real event, bringing the trainees not only to explanation of how something works, how are subtitles for deaf and hard of hearing done, how is this and that organized, but really this brings them to have the real experience, but to have the experience also with creative teams and with the target audiences. Our main goal in this cooperation, when we brought students of translation and interpreting programs, but also students of sign language interpreting program from other University in Trnava, was to support future networks of the future professionals, because one of the main problems in our country is that there are not enough professionals to actually deal with accessibility to cultural spaces. The starting point, although this might sound a bit strict, was really the preference of graduates, young professionals or trainees, maybe even people who wanted to do some upskilling, who already had some experience with translation and interpreting, audiovisual translation and accessibility, even if on just academic level, because again, the festival is very big and this was huge responsibility towards the whole project. So starting with someone from the very, very scratch, not even have experience in translating and interpreting would be probably quite a challenge. What we applied was after the basic training our trainees basically gained at university was collaborative learning strategy approach, where we divided the students into teams so that the first levels of coordination, consulting, checking whether things were done properly, whether they would work, was done on smaller level. And very often we were mixing the students also with some representatives of the communities. This was not always possible because it's a lot of work, but I think it worked very well there where we were able to do it. Of course, there was a supervision by expert for each task, and we had several groups which focus on other areas. So it was communication and PR, translation and editing of the texts, interpreting and sign language, interpreting, subtitling, SDH, and audiovisual and audio description. Now, of course, as I already said, the main gain for the trainees was to get this experience. But I think what is important to emphasize if you are thinking about similar project is that you have to be very responsible, not only towards the project, but also towards your trainees. The interns should never be seen as cheap labor. And we have to be very careful there because this happens in cultural spaces. We have to be frank about it because it seems as an opportunity to maybe deal with something where there is lack of funding. So what was very important for us in the project was to have very clear cooperation framework and specification of roles, workflows, and deadlines from the very beginning. We were explaining why deadlines need to be what they are. We contracted the cooperation on the level of institutions, but also on the level of each individual student for each individual task, especially in terms of copyrights if students were working with films, because I think by this project we were learning them really a lot about accessibility, audiences, but also about what our profession should be if we want to do it responsibly. Our trainees in the end this year, to sum up, worked on interpreting throughout various debates and workshops. They worked on communication, PR. They cooperated on communication with some of the viewers and some of the specific target groups. They worked on 30 films for the festival and 10 films which were broadcasted with full access. And I think it was a great experience for them, but mainly the experience was real but safe, and it was done in strictly supervised environment. Now, there is definitely no time to cover everything, but there is one last thing I would like to mention, and then I give word to Francesca for the end. And of course, we will both be happy to direct you to some resources when you can find more information about our project. But besides providing quick insight into how things can be done in various regions of Europe and how we did the things, I think one of the most important points of what we both talk about is that if we work in this model and if we put emphasis on integrated access and inclusive way of communicating, and if we bring future professionals into the process, this is the most essential thing for all of the involved agents in provision of accessibility, mainly because of the moment of mutual learning. So the learning is there not only for our students, the learning was there for cultural spaces, for organizers. I believe they learned a lot. But also for us, because even for me personally, I can say that I learned a lot, especially from the discussions and the whole inclusive design we were working on from the very beginning with various groups of audience we had there, maybe even groups of audience I'm normally not focusing on at my work. So to conclude, I give word to Francesca, and then we give word to you in case there is something you would like to ask or comment on.
Thank you, Emília. And yes, as Emília was saying, when we talk about inclusive projects, inclusive design, inclusive approach, we are referring to include everyone in the decision-making process, in the development of access services, in the co-creation and in the redesign of accessible and inclusive experiences. The process should be inform the decision-making process at the concept stage. We have learned ourselves to ask ourselves first for questions. So what should we do next? What are the needs? How can the needs be met? And how well are the needs met? So 4 steps, let's say: manage, explore, create, and evaluate. And everything, of course, together with the final users who are actually not just users, but co-creators. So we all create a project together, including all the different abilities that we have in the team. So we don't have an actual answer, but many questions, because these inclusive approaches are continuous experiments, actually. So I think that's it. So we are happy to take your questions. We have some references, but as Emília was saying, we are happy to share whatever you are interested in.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you both for telling us a little bit about your projects, and for also sharing maybe some of the challenges that you also came up with. I'm just looking at the chat to see if there are any new comments. There are just some thank yous and appreciative comments. I have a question while the others maybe are thinking for. Oh, there is actually a question from Marta. Thank you, Marta. It says, how is it possible to apply for projects like yours? I'm not sure if Marta is a student or a practitioner or an academic or simply a citizen. Maybe Francesca, how do you know how, where do you start? And then maybe Emília can also tell us.
I think we would both say the similar. I'll just very briefly say, because I actually somehow touched upon how it worked. So for example, in the projects I presented, and not in this one, but also other similar ones we worked on, usually our experience is that since the place where I work created a name of being, actually we are the only department in Slovakia training accessibility, which is a bit sad. But usually our case is that if someone is interested from side of cultural sector, they do contact us. And in small country, this happens very quickly because everyone knows everyone, so it works. But what it is for students, because I think Marta just added she's a student. Then, for example, at our department, we always publish a call for our students who are students from the Department of Translation Studies in Nitra. But also we published an open call for other people who would like to cooperate. So it's not, other people are not excluded. What is important is maybe to follow the fora of institutions, that they are preparing something similar. And I think most of them call openly for and asking people whether they would like to contribute in any ways. Already last year, we did have people also cooperating who were not from Slovakia, so this is possible. So for our case, maybe if you follow the website or the Facebook of my department, or if you just get in touch, this is perfect. Francesca, I know it's very specific in your case, also in many other projects you work on, so I think it could be also very interesting to mention yours.
Well, actually, yes, as Emília said, normally organizations and theaters contact us to create a project from scratch together, or sometimes the associations, so the users themselves contact us to create something new together with them, or if the organizations if they contact us, then we get in touch with the associations to work together, so to create an inclusive team again. So yeah, it's basically like that. I mean, we have some training programs for students as well. For example, a recent master's program, and Gabriele, Uzzo, Emília, Alina, Nina, they are all in our teaching staff and for students. So you can simply get in touch and we can share some more info if you want, Marta.
Okay, thank you very much.